Hi guys, my name is Jennifer Jennings, and I will be looking at Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis from a feminist lens, with a special emphasis on how fundamentalist Islam plays an important role in the text. So to start off, I want to define the word Persepolis because I think that it requires a bit of understanding. According to Merriam-Webster, Persepolis was an ancient city in the Persian Empire that comprises modern-day southwestern Iran. But I think in terms of this book, it's Satrapi's way of connecting herself to the memory of her people and then making her own contribution to that memory. Cultural and historical memory plays a key role in the book. Anush, Margie's uncle, tells her to remember the stories he has told her of the revolution, and then later her grandmother encourages her to do the same before she leaves to go to Austria. I think Persepolis as a graphic novel is Satrapi's way of honoring this memory. And understanding the cultural and historical context is important for understanding the feminist reading of the novel. Lee Gilmore and Elizabeth Marshall address Persepolis in their article Girls in Crisis, and they essentially argue that Persepolis reverses the script when it comes to narratives about girls in danger. Obviously, Margie is trapped in a violent political regime that uses religion as a tool of oppression, but rather than relying on someone or something to save her, Margie talks back. She finds different discourses of rebellion throughout the book that sort of flip the script. To give some context for this traditional girl in danger script before we talk about feminism, I invite you to watch a clip from Shrek the Musical. The song particularly is I Know It's Today, sung by Princess Fiona. In the song, Fiona talks about being rescued from the tower by her Prince Charming, but she kind of deconstructs the fairy tales that she is simultaneously idolizing with lines about Prince Charming's manly hose and references to the fact that her white knight and his steed will look just like the pictures in her storybook, when in fact it's an ogre and a donkey that come to save her. As you're listening to the song, or after you listen to the song, I want you to take some time to answer these questions in your daybook. How do the fairy tales that we read establish our expectations for stories about women? Are we disappointed when stories about women don't involve some semblance of romance or crisis without a white knight? Do fairy tales with a white knight and a happy ending preclude a feminist reading, or can we have our happy ending and our feminism too? So take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back. So just like there are rules and strictures for fairy tales, there are also rules for feminist criticism, although they're pretty loose. So let's take a moment to define feminism. Feminism is the belief that people are equal regardless of gender, and feminists are people who work for political, social, and economic equality for both men and women. And based on these two definitions, feminist criticism seeks to advocate for equality within the canon by doing something called revisionist literary history. Essentially, they're validating all cultures and creative people who have contributed to society and finding them a place in the canon. According to Charles Bressler in his Introduction to Literary Criticism, the ultimate motto of feminist criticism is that women must define themselves and articulate their roles, their values, their aspirations, and their place in society. One way they can do this is through literature. Feminist criticism has existed in some form or fashion since the 14th century with feminist Christine de Pizan, but it started coming into its own in the 18th century with Aphra Behn and Mary Wollstonecraft. Probably the best known of these is Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the book A Vindication for the Rights of Women, which was the first literary representation of the feminist ideal of equal rights for both men and women. Feminist criticism and feminism as a political movement didn't really emerge as a major movement until the 20th century. In the literary world, this exploded with works like Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which addresses the ways in which women are treated inferior in society, specifically in literary society. Feminist criticism exploded with second-wave feminism in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, with women like Elaine Showalter, Sandra Gilbert, Susan Gubar, Annette Kolodny, Julia Kristeva, and Betty Friedan, who asserted the woman's place in the canon. So there are several types of feminist criticism. I've listed a few highlighted in Bressler's introduction, including Anglo-American feminism, post-structuralist feminism, materialist feminism, postmodern feminism, cultural feminism, separatist feminism, third world feminism, and post-colonial feminism. Yeah, that's obviously a lot. I'd like to focus on two of the more broad spectrum categories. Those are post-structuralist feminisms and postmodern feminisms, because I think they really encapsulate the feminist discourse in Persepolis. So first, I want to look at postmodern feminisms and its commentary on discourse. Judith Butler is the leading theorist in postmodern feminism, and she basically argues that gender is a social, temporal, constructed, and impossible to embody ideal. So whatever we think about gender, whatever social concepts we have of gender, actual people can't fulfill those expectations. So think about some of those gender stereotypes that we carry. You might want to jot down a few in your daybook as they come to mind. How do those stereotypes dictate your behavior? Are you even conscious of your gender on a daily basis or a weekly basis? Butler argues that the ways in which we express our gender is its own discourse. So think about how you express your gender as we explore this some more. And we'll look at how Margie uses her appearance as its own form of political protest. I'll give you a little minute to do that. Secondly, I want to look at post-structuralist feminisms, which essentially applies any post-structuralist theory to feminist criticism. With this post-structuralist lens, I want to look at how Margie deconstructs the fundamentalist imposed gender identity of the Muslim regime. I also want to look at some of the implicit Marxist theory within the book, which is interesting considering her parents are upper-class, wealthy, educated citizens of Tehran. However, Margie's uncle Anoush particularly supports a Marxist socialist agenda over and against the fundamentalism of the current political regime. And Margie sort of uses this deconstruction to fuel her discourse on what it means to be a woman. But before we move on to these applications, I wanted to share this 5-minute interview with Marjan Satrapi. You can click on the link and go listen to the interview. It's in the context of the release of the movie version of Persepolis in 2007, which combines this book that we read for class and also its sequel about her life in Austria and France. The link to the interview is in the handout, and so is the link to the trailer of the movie. So you can watch the trailer if you're interested. The movie was filmed entirely in French, so if you want to try to find a copy of the movie somewhere, make sure that it has English subtitles so you understand what's going on. Anyway, in the interview that I've linked, Satrapi talks specifically about her own feminist interpretation of the book towards the end, and I thought that part especially was really fascinating, but the whole interview is just excellent. So I'll give you a second to watch that. So now that we're back, let's look at some of the postmodernist feminist discourse in Persepolis. According to Gilmore and Marshall, whose article Girls in Crisis I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, women of color can use their autobiographies to create a new discourse contrary from the discourse of the primary culture. But I think Persepolis is a counter discourse, not only of the fundamentalism in Iran, but of the view of Iranian women in America as being totally oppressed. I mean, sure, it's true. Lots of people were and are oppressed by this regime. However, I think Persepolis offers the counter narrative that these women don't need white people to come in and save them from their oppression. Any understanding of post-colonialism will tell you that that never works. Ultimately, Gilmore and Marshall argue that Margie doesn't need saving because she grows up in a privileged progressive family that shelters her as best as they can from the radical fundamentalism of her culture. In fact, young Margie says she wants to be an educated, liberated woman, which is not in line with the gendered discourse of Islamic fundamentalism that doesn't support the education or liberation of women, and Margie kind of acknowledges that. You see in Persepolis this intentional juxtaposition of normal girlhood with political turmoil to show that Margie is not only distinguished from the culture around her, but that her cultural identity is entirely separate from the revolution in which she is entrenched. In fact, Margie seems to appropriate a lot of Western culture. For example, when her parents go on vacation to Istanbul, they bring her back posters and tapes of punk rock bands. And in a really powerful scene, Margie wears punk rock clothes out on the street, and she's stopped by women who are considered guardians of the revolution and who basically enforce the fundamentalist rules for women. So Margie makes up this total sob story about how her stepmother will burn her with an iron if she's late coming home. And the women allow her to go home just so she can go home and sing Kids in America. This scene is in the animated movie, so I've included the link in the handout and in the presentation. But there aren't any English subtitles, so you might want to follow along with the scene in the book so you can kind of know what's going on, what's happening when. Hilary Shute takes this concept to a new level in her article, The Texture of Retracing in Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. She writes that feminist graphic narratives, experimental and accessible, will play an important role in defining feminisms that could provide a model for political conscious, yet post-avant-garde theory and practice. Not only is Margie politically conscious, but she's also religiously conscious. Although Margie believes in God, she sees a definite disconnect between the God she has a personal relationship with and the God of the people who are pushing the Islamic fundamentalism on the culture. Her dad embodies this disconnect when they are stopped by a police officer after a party one night. It's obvious that they have been drinking, even though that it's against the Muslim laws, but Margie's dad is able to bribe the officer to ignore it. And although he is relieved that they were able to get away, he's also enraged that the officer took a bribe. He declares their faith has nothing to do with their ideology. Shute argues that even Satrapi's pictures, which serve as their own discourse in the novel, fit with the feminist tropes because they make the hidden life of the people visible. For example, Margie listens to music in secret and they close the blinds to play Monopoly. And yet life is going on in spite of the restrictions that the government has placed on them. In fact, as early as the first page, Satrapi is representing how things like the veil were misunderstood by young children who had no concept of the rituals they were forced to embody and the culture of violence that was perpetuated. In this particular frame, you've got one girl wearing the veil, calling herself the monster of darkness, and another girl playing execution in the top corner. And then in the bottom corner, one girl is using the other girl's veil as a harness to ride her like a horse. So what is supposed to be an important religious symbol of purity is actually rendered meaningless. And according to Shute, it's through this discourse that Satrapi reevaluates the censorship of her culture through an Iranian perspective. I know that's a lot. Let's take a minute to pause and reflect in the daybook. How do you express your identity through what you wear or what you listen to or what you watch on TV? In what ways might the expression of your identity be its own political discourse? Now let's look at the post-structuralist feminist readings of the text. Margie declares in the first few pages, at the age of 6, I was already sure I was the last prophet, because our maid did not eat with us, because my father had a Cadillac, and above all, because my grandmother's knees always ached. These seem to be cultural conditions for prophecy, but I think Persepolis is its own form of Satrapi's prophecy. In the true nature of a prophet, she carries a social justice message and gives commentary on the current political situation. She declares, the reason for my shame and for the revolution is the same, the difference between social classes. Marjane recognizes her complicity in this because her parents are upper class and support the causes of the educated upper class. However, they do not support the fundamentalist regime because they see it as contrasting with their own Western intellectualism. Still, this is an implicitly Marxist message of social justice that Margie filters through her family's own political beliefs. Later, though, she gets in trouble for reiterating the radical messages that she hears at home, and she begins to realize the dangers associated with being a prophet. Her mom says, you know what they do to the young girls they arrest? You know that it's against the law to kill a virgin. So a guard of the revolution marries her and takes her virginity before executing her. Do you understand what that means? Margie's political speech comes with a price and ultimately results in her exile. The violence against women that is associated with Islamic fundamentalism is the real risk to Satrapi's prophetic voice. So as young Margie is deconstructing her own social class and becoming enamored with political activism, adult Marjane Satrapi is deconstructing the daily routine that she experienced, the traumatic experience of trauma and the revolution, and her own teenage life. Satrapi doesn't shy away from addressing issues of controlling women, representation in spite of the fundamentalism, and the female support of the fundamentalist revolution. Satrapi makes this personal by addressing her mother's own sexual harassment at the hands of this fundamentalist regime. When her mother's car breaks down, Margie and her dad go to pick her mother up and see her visibly distraught. Her mother says, The bastards, they insulted me. They said that women like me should be pushed up against a wall and fucked and then thrown in the garbage, and that if I don't want that to happen, I should wear the veil. In this way, women and their appearance are blamed for the despicable male violence, all under the guise of religion. But this is an aberration. It's a fundamentalist ideology that ultimately becomes the opiate of the masses. This translates to appearance, which becomes its own discourse, and according to Satrapi, an ideological sign. Gilmore and Marshall write, the popularity of Satrapi's text is due in part to its potential to support the imaginary link between the vulnerable girl and the disempowered adult female political subject. But I don't think that Satrapi is at all disempowered. She is using her writing as her voice to take back the power robbed from her as a child, and that necessitated her exile from her home. At the end of the novel, before she leaves for Austria, her grandmother tells her, always keep your dignity and be true to yourself. Ultimately, I think Persepolis is a testament to this. Satrapi is struggling to stay true to herself and embracing her culture while still understanding the failures of her culture. It's a powerful narrative that embodies the tension between a young girl who is oppressed by her culture and a young girl who is ultimately rescued by Western culture. Now that Satrapi is removed, she can be a prophetic voice that she always desired to be, which brings the book full circle. So let's take another minute to pause and reflect in the daybook. What do you think it means to be a prophet? How does Satrapi's prophetic discourse play into current understandings of how dress and appearance influence how we perceive violence against women? I'll give you a minute to reflect on that. Persepolis is not unique in its story of Middle Eastern feminism and the feminist fight against Muslim fundamentalism. Deborah Ellis wrote the book The Breadwinner, which Angelina Jolie adapted into a movie on Netflix. I've included a link to the NPR article on the movie in the PowerPoint and in the handout. But basically, it's the story of an Afghani family who have to depend on their youngest daughter to earn food for the family. The story is both beautiful and tragic, and if you watch it, you'll definitely need a box of Kleenex. But powerful stories like The Breadwinner and Persepolis change the narrative of stories about women, specifically women from the Middle East. These women are strong and capable and can contribute powerful stories. Their voices must be heard, and we must listen. So thank you for participating in this theory workshop. I've included my works cited here, and I've also included it in the handout. All of the links that I have mentioned in the PowerPoint are also included in the handout as well. So be sure and look at all of those. Thank you so much.